Hello. We're looking now at the Crucifixion, the most important day in history. It is, as someone has said, the very hinge of history. In John chapter 19, and from verse 1, we read these words. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. Once more Pilate came out and said to the Jews, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing that crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge in him." The Jews insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he proclaimed himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid and went back inside the palace. And then we read how he questioned Jesus again. And then as the people once again cried, take him away, crucify him," Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. And then we read, "So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. Here they crucified him, and with two others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, 'Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.' Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, 'Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews.' Pilate answered, 'What I have written, I have written.'" And so as we see that scene, we realize the agony that Jesus went through. We know that as Jesus was crucified, that was not the first time that Jesus had suffered pain that day. Before crucifixion itself took place, Jesus was scourged. Now, this was a terrible torture. The victim was stripped, his hands were tied behind him, and he was tied to a post with his back bent double and conveniently exposed to the lash. The lash itself was a long leather thong, studded at intervals with sharpened pieces of bone and pellets of lead. Such scourging was always preceded crucifixion, and it reduced the naked body to strips of raw flesh and inflamed and bleeding wheels. Some died under it, others lost their reason under it, and few remained conscious at the end of it. And so as we try to picture that scene, we realize the physical agony that Jesus went through. There was this terrible scourging. And then there was the crown of thorns that was plaited and placed upon the head of Jesus. Here we have a crown of thorns. This is made of buckthorn and thought by many to be the type of thorns that would have been used. Maybe there was a bush or a tree in the corner of the Antonia fortress where the soldiers were, and so they would just have plaited this and then pressed it upon his head, and so blood would have run down across his face. Of course, they were making fun of Jesus. They realized that he was the King of the Jews, and so they thought that they would have sport with him, and they plaited a crown of thorns. And so Jesus was crucified. He was led through the streets of Jerusalem, often by the longest route. He would have had that plaque around his neck, which claimed that he was indeed Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, written in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in Greek, and in Latin. Everyone could tell that who he was. It was the custom to put the man's charge on his neck and then to hang it on the cross. This happened to Jesus, but the only thing they could find to say about him, that he was indeed the King of the Jews, the Messiah. And so he was led out through the gate, probably the one on the site of the present Damascus gate, led across the road and to that place of the skull. And as it says in the Gospels, there they crucified him. Now, it is easy sometimes to dwell on the agony of the cross, to think of the terrible humiliation and pain that Jesus went through. But perhaps it's better just to really concentrate on the main thing. Jesus was crucified. We know that in many paintings and depictions of the crucifixion, Jesus is seen wearing a loincloth. But I think he would have been naked, which would have added to the humiliation. And then the cross he carried would not have been the full cross, but just the crossbar. And I'm sure the full cross would have been too heavy for Jesus to manage. And so he would carry the crossbar. And then as he came to the place of crucifixion, they would have laid Jesus out upon the cross. They would have tied the crossbar onto the cross. Jesus was placed with his arms outstretched, and there would have been these ordinary handmade nails and maybe an ordinary hammer like that, which would have knocked the nails through just at the hands there, just below the hand. And then his feet would have been put together, and a larger nail with a leather washer or a wooden washer would have been knocked through the feet. Now, if the crucified one had just rested, without any support, the skin would have just pulled through on the hands. It obviously wasn't capable of taking the full weight of the body. And so they had what was known as a saddle. And this took some of the weight. It was uncomfortable, but it would have allowed a person to hang there on the cross for many hours. And so Jesus was raised up on the cross. They would have had the ropes which they pulled the cross into place. And then they would have taken this wooden mallet, something like this, and they would have knocked in the wedges that held the cross in position. And so Jesus was placed there upon the cross, near this busy gate, in order that everybody might take note. You remember those who said, who cried out to him, if you are the Son of God, come down from the cross. I think it was General Booth who said, well, we believe in him because he didn't come down. And so Jesus hung and died there for our sin. He died in our place. And as the hours went by, first of all, some ladies came who were wealthy women. They would have had these sea sponges on a cane. They offered drugged wine to Jesus, as they did to all criminals. This would have consisted of just a grain of frankincense placed into a flagon of wine, and then they dipped the sponge in and offered it to the crucified one. We read that Jesus refused it. But perhaps it helps to explain how terrible the crucifixion was, and how generally it was such a cruel punishment. Now, I believe there were the Roman soldiers there who would have been in charge of actually crucifying Jesus, but they're also in Jerusalem the temple guard. I believe they were the ones that arrested Jesus, and they were more like the temple police in charge of crowd control. I've got a costume there with a temple guard. Some believe they would have been made up of Levites, and they would have worn the ordinary Levite costume. But I believe they would have been more like the Roman auxiliary soldiers. Not so heavily armed as the ordinary Roman legionnaires. They would have had a lighter helmet, just an ordinary stabbing spear. They would have had the chainmail instead of the breastpiece. They would have had a lighter shield, although probably quite a big one, because if people were throwing rocks at them, they wanted some protection. And they would have had just the small sword, the dagger. And so they were able to control the crowds that came to the temple. It says that Judas Iscariot led them to where he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And they were the ones that arrested Jesus. Well, all that was behind him, and there Jesus hung upon the cross. It was just as if God would not allow everybody to gaze upon his son's agony as the sky turned black. And then, finally, Jesus cried out, "It is finished." And then, as we know, Joseph of Arimathea came to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. He was surprised that Jesus had died so quickly. Jesus was given to Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. And so he underwent a proper burial. Now, the other criminals, the criminals that were crucified with Jesus, one said, we read in Luke's Gospel, one said it cried out and in scorn at Jesus, and the other said, don't do that. We deserve to be hung, to be crucified. But this man has done nothing wrong. He said simply, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." And so I believe that man would have been with Jesus in the heavenlies. Now, Jesus died on the cross. He was placed into the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. But the other criminals, just as Jesus would have been if Joseph had not intervened, they were just slung into the rubbish pit, into the place Gehenna in the Hinnom Valley. And of course, there would be no record of them. They just went in with the animals that had died and all the rubbish and all the mess and muck that was just thrown in there because obviously a city like Jerusalem would have generated a lot of rubbish. And so they were put in there and nothing more is known of them. And if that had been Jesus' fate, well then we would have no record of the resurrection. But because God intervened and his son was placed into Joseph's tomb, so we have the record of his glorious resurrection. And so as we think of his death upon the cross, as we know that we should have died, but he died in our place, So we are thankful and grateful, and we place our trust in him, that we might be forgiven, we might be cleansed, we might have new life, we might enjoy resurrection life because of Jesus. And so as we think of this great day, we do so with sorrow, but with thanksgiving. And I hope as we meditate upon these things, we will give thanks to God that Jesus died in our place.